Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Let the filibustering begin.
Welcome to Nerd Party.
Hello and welcome to Filibuster here on the Nerd Party Network. I'm Lee Hutchison, and today I'm over the moon to be joined by one of the key writers and producers of the Stargate franchise and the creator and writer of Dark Matter, Joseph Mallozzi. Hello Joseph, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for joining me. I really appreciate it. As we've spoke with writers before of TV, film, literature, and I just love to know what their journey to becoming a sort of full-time writer was, because it's such a challenging job to take on, and I love to know what makes people take that risk to go from perhaps maybe the safest jobs to a job where it's probably faces so much rejection, so much challenges. What was your journey to becoming a writer?
Very interesting. As a kid, I always used to love to read. In fact, I remember my mother gifted me the complete works of William Shakespeare when I was in elementary school, and I remember having a duotang where I used to keep logs of every act of every play. And ultimately, my mother recognized my love for reading, my appreciation for reading, so she would sort of feed my habit by gifting me books, usually science fiction, because that's the type of stuff I love to read. So, when I was younger, I would read Asimov and Clarke and Harlan Ellison and Ray Bradbury, and really influenced by those writers very early on. I mean, I remember being in grade 4 and writing short stories, and they were all along kind of the same lines, kind of sci-fi and a little dark, and it always had that twist at the end. And I remember growing up, and Emma would ask me, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I always said writer. And my mother, always said, well, okay. I mean, it's always nice to, want to be a writer, but writing isn't really a career. Writing is something you do on the side. So maybe you're a lawyer and you write on the side. And I was ultimately very fortunate in that I got my foot in the door in animation, the world of animation. I had actually written a novel, which turned out to be a terrible first novel, that I ended up turning into an equally terrible feature. But it gave me a taste for screenwriting, script writing. And so what I decided to do was I wanted to get into screenwriting, or the movie business, because, of course, when you're a writer and you're looking to get into the industry, you automatically think, oh, I want to write for film, when, in fact, if you're smart, you want to go into television because, A, there are more opportunities, and B, TV is where it's at. TV is where the writers have their powers, where basically they can become creative showrunners. Whereas in film, really, you're lucky if your first draft survived, or if you're even invited on set. So film is really more of a director's game. TV is more of a writer's game. And so, but at the time, I was just looking to get my foot in the door. And so I'd written. They always tell you, write your specs. So I had one original pilot script, and I had one spec script for, I think, Seinfeld at the time. And so I sent out my resume to about 100 different production companies looking to sort of get my foot in the door as a script reader. And I'd say maybe less than 10 responded, most of them with no's. And one company responded, but they were an animation company. And they said, well, look, we don't have jobs for script readers, but what we do is we hire freelance writers. And if you think you can write for animation, this is how it works. And so they sent me a Bible of a show. The first show I ever wrote for was a show called The Busy World of Richard Scarry, which is based on the works of a children's author, Richard Scarry. And I pitched, and I made my first sale. It was Patrick Pig Learns to Talk. It was a 10-minute or 5 or 10-minute short for that animation series. And that's how it started for me. I mean, I think I made, what was it? I think $6,000 the first year freelancing, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I'm actually making a living as a writer. If I can double that next year, I'll be thrilled. And of course, I doubled it the next year, and I doubled it again. And as I sort of went on, I worked my way up from a writer to story editing to creating and developing shows for animation, and then ultimately I transitioned to teen sitcoms with a show called Student Bodies. And then 1 Hour Action Adventure until ultimately landing on Stargate SG-1 with my then writing partner, Paul Mullie. And, we landed as co-producers and writers, staff writers. And we were told, well, the show would go maybe 2 seasons and then we'd be free to go our separate ways. And we thought, oh, great. And, of course, that 2-year promise turned into like a 12-year, glorious 12-year run for us. And we worked our way up from co-producers to ultimately showrunners. And, while I was on Stargate, I took the time to start develop my own material. And Dark Matter was one of the things that I developed over time. In fact, over many, many years. Every year I thought, this is the end. This is the last season of Stargate, and I'll be able to go out with Dark Matter. But, every year we would get picked up. So one of the nice things about that was it really allowed me to flesh out the backstory of the characters and really the arcs and the stories of where I wanted to go with Dark Matter, which made it all be more frustrating when the show was canceled, because I had a 5-year plan. I knew where all the stories were going, where all the characters would end up, and the show was doing very well, and the fact that it was canceled, it was frankly a bit galling. But to back it up, all this to say, whenever first-time writers or new writers approach me about how to get their foot in the door, I always tell them, the standard advice is to write a spec, write an original, write a spec a show that you like, that you can demonstrate, you can capture the voices and tone of the show, and then think about trying to get in your foot in the door in animation, the world of animation, because they tend to be more receptive to new writers. The format is exactly the same, the script writing format. It forces you to think visually, to hone your craft, and more importantly, it allows you to get paid while you're doing it. So that is my offbeat advice to first-time writers.
I have to ask, as a huge Seinfeld fan, what was your Seinfeld spec script like?
I think I don't recall. I think it was basically Jerry and George and Elaine. It was actually like a road trip episode where they're off to a party, and Kramer, meanwhile, was building this soccer team from Quito, I don't know, in South America. I don't remember, but it was basically I think back now of all the shows I could have spec'd. It's kind of interesting. I selected Seinfeld because really my bread and butter is the 1 hour action adventure, and I never really thought about going into comedy, and yet the type of stuff I like to write, like Stargate Atlantis, like SG-1, and like Dark Matter, has an undercurrent of humor. In fact, when we were auditioning for Dark Matter, I had to make sure that all the actors could deliver on the comedy, because I'm a firm believer in humor going such a long way towards allowing audiences to connect with characters. It's almost like a shortcut. Like, I think McKay was so beloved because David Hewlett was so masterful at conveying this kind of flawed but ultimately humorous character that people could connect with. And in much the same way as Zoe Palmer played the android on Dark Matter, I was actually quite surprised in that really when I first envisioned the show, the android character was fairly minor. And then really as a result of the scripts coming in short in the first season, I ended up having to write extra scenes. And I naturally gravitated towards the android because Zoe really made the character pop. And her performance was so endearing that I just fell in love with the character. And so the character really became another crew member over time. And I was always heartened by the fact that whenever at the end of the year, the networks would put together those focus groups, those silly focus groups, the android always topped the list for favorite character.
Everyone loves an android in science fiction. I think they always seem to become people's favorite characters.
Yeah.
I'm curious as well that when you were talking about, say, sort of spec scripts, do you think that's something that's really changed a lot in the industry over the past few decades? That I caught a tweet by sort of the Star Trek Discovery's writer room this week where they were like, please do not ever send us scripts. We cannot take them on board because we could be sued if any of those ideas end up in something that we've done. Whereas before, in sort of the 90s, people could send in scripts for sort of freelance, going, hey, this is our script, and you could get a call in, hey, come on board, we'll produce it. Do you think that's something that's perhaps changed for the better or worse for kind of writers?
Well, to be honest with you, I've never been in a situation where we've kind of invited spec scripts. So when I talk about spec scripts, as a writer writing a spec, I'm talking about just basically as a means of demonstrating your ability, like I said, to capture voice and tone, not really to try to get your foot in the door with a specific show tailored to a specific script tailored to a specific show. For instance, on Stargate, it was much the same thing. We couldn't read fanfic. We couldn't read spec scripts, specifically Stargate spec script, because for exactly that same reason, legal reasons. If one of the ideas ended up on the show, it would be a can of worms, really. So certainly, I think they've gotten even more careful about it. I remember hearing that Star Trek, maybe Voyager, at some point welcomed specs, which I found altogether bizarre.
Yeah, the Next Generation was big for it. Like, that's how I think kind of someone like Ronald D. Moore, I think that was his big break, was through sort of spec scripts.
Yeah, you know what? If they did it once, I mean, like I said, I mean, I come from a world where really it was always a no-no, so I find it kind of odd. If it worked for people, I think that's great, and what a great opportunity. But really, I haven't heard of it being done since.
You were mentioning as well that you became writing partners with Paul Mullie, and that kind of was a relationship that went into sort of Stargate. How did you two become joint script writers, and what's that dynamic like for producing a script? Or, you hear so many times that you hear like joint writers will either be on opposite sides of the room, or will be one will write one act, the other will write another act, and it'll be spread or email. What was that kind of relationship like on a practical level?
To be honest with you, it was all over the place. I remember at the time I first started writing for animation, and he was actually I think he was planning to go do his master's or his PhD, and I suggested, why don't we co-write something? And so we co-wrote a feature that we used as a spec to really sort of get our foot in the doors various places. And then when we actually started writing together, in the beginning we would actually write in the same room, and we would run dialogue back and forth with each other. And then once we actually really got into Stargate, at first we started in this. We would visit each other in each other's offices and write that way. And then just because of the pressures, the demands of production, one of us would go off and write, let's say, the first 5 pages and send it off to the other, and the other one would rewrite those first 5 pages and then forge ahead and do the next 10 pages and send it back, and we'd pitch it back and forth. But ultimately, near the end of the production, we just got so busy that really we were writing our scripts separately. So I would write a first draft, or he would write a first draft. We would swap and maybe do passes. But ultimately, we were really writing alone. I loved writing with him because he had his strengths, and I had my strengths, and he was very good at constructing bulletproof narratives, where I was always more the big idea guy or the comedy guy, the small character moment guy. And so I think we really complemented one another. But as we got busier on Stargate, we just found that it was easier to write our scripts solo. Although, I think the last 3 years on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, almost I think the past 5 years on Stargate, we were writing our scripts separately, although we shared screen credits simply because I tended to write more of the originals, which we were paid for, whereas he tended to rewrite a lot of the other writers. And those rewrites tended to be anything from simple polishes to sometimes page 1 rewrites, and he didn't get paid for it, and he didn't get credit for it. So really, in fairness to the partnership, we ended up co-sharing the story credit. I mean, it's a very different world. there are pros and cons. I mean, on the one hand, there are times when you'll be battling with your partner on creative elements. On the other hand, it's nice to have a partner to take some of the heat off at times where you reach an impasse and are unable to really write your way out of it. He can come in and he or she can come in and throw out an idea that you hadn't even thought of that shakes things up and sends it in another direction. So I mean, it progressed from in terms of our partnership, writing partnership, from very much a collaboration, like physically collaborative in the same room, to pitching back and forth over email, to ultimately really just a partnership, writing partnership in name only.
I think with your arrival on Stargate came with pretty much considered one of the most iconic episodes, Window of Opportunity. What was your process of how did you become you guys are going to be hired, we're taking you on as a kind of a writing team? How did they kind of get you involved, or was it one of those ones sending round kind of this is our portfolio of work and then being called in? Because it seemed that you went from just that one episode and producers and that was really you by sort of the end of the seasons. You're writing some of the biggest episodes of the series, really.
Yeah, I mean, we joined in season 4, and at the time Brad and Robert were the showrunners, and they hadn't had much luck finding staff writers, just because Stargate was such a tough nut to crack creatively because of the backstory, because I mean, just tonally, it was very different from a Trek, for instance, and in terms of type, the mythology. But our agent at the time represented Robert Cooper, and he knew that they were looking for writers, and so he said, "Hey, you can pitch them some ideas." So we prepared 3 to 5 pitches, which I think is the perfect number of pitches. 3, no less than 3, no more than 5. And we pitched them, and they liked 2 of them. One that ended up being Scorched Earth, the first script we wrote. The second one ended up being A Window of Opportunity. So we pitched them, and they said, "Okay, great." They selected Scorched Earth as to basically test us, if you will. I mean, they hired us to write the script, and the understanding was if we did a good job on the script, it would earn us a staff position on the show. And if it didn't, then we would get a credit, which and of course get paid for the script, which was fine with me at the time. The prospect of moving to the other side of the country was somewhat foreboding. I just bought a house, so I thought, it's really either scenario would be great. And so we wrote Scorched Earth. We wrote an outline. They had some notes. We wrote out the outlines. This is Brad and Robert, who are the showrunners. We went to script. We wrote the first draft, and we sent it off to them. I remember Rob telling me that at the time, he and Brad were doing their annual Hawaii golf trips with the families, and he and Brad were sitting on the flight, and they only had one copy of the script, and Brad couldn't bring himself to read it, and he just handed it to Rob, and he says, "I can't read it because if it's bad, my vacation is ruined." And so basically, Rob says, "Okay, I'll read it." And he read it, and then he just turned to Brad and said, "Enjoy your vacation." So that's how we landed the Stargate gig. And we were invited on, and like I said, we came on as co-producers. The understanding we would probably go 2 more seasons, and we'd be done. And of course, basically, we ended on Showtime. We were picked up by Sci-Fi for we would assume would be 1 more season, but every year we kept on getting picked up and kept being picked up until the year that I assumed we actually were going to picked up. I always assumed we were going to be canceled until the final year when SG-1 completed its 10th season, or was close to completing its 10th season. I thought we'd be back for sure, but that was the year we were canceled. But in any case, one of the great things about Stargate that really my biggest takeaway was Brad Wright and Robert Cooper, who were the showrunners. It starts from the top down. They were always very supportive of promoting from within. So Paul and I, we learned the ropes. We learned how to produce by watching Brad and Robert. They invited us, down the set. They, we went to all the prep meetings. We went into editing with them, so that by the end of the run, we were showrunners. We were all de facto showrunners, and we were able, we would be given the tools to go out and run our own show, Dark Matter. Another great thing about Stargate was they'd worked out all the bugs by the time we landed on season 4, and by the bugs I mean, it was very much a family atmosphere. Everybody. It was always very challenging, but everybody was very happy to be there, and everybody was very supportive of one another. And it was just a really happy place to be. People enjoyed going to work. And then I ended up working on another production, which was quite the opposite, and it was a rude awakening for me. And it turns out that essentially, really, the happy set is really more atypical than the norm. So when it was time to put together the team for Dark Matter, I just wanted to make sure that I emulated the Stargate model, and people were happy to be there, and we were very, it was a very positive work environment. And ultimately, that's one of the things that I took away, that I will always take away from Dark Matter, is whenever guest stars came and did the show, they really complimented us on the fact that it was such a great, positive vibe, and people were happy to be there.
Is that one of these sort of things that you're perfect, because this was a type of question I was going to ask you about, like becoming producers and creating a writing room. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you can't almost probably learn in sort of school, or kind of out there when you're writing up your own scripts? And learning about that from people and watching it, is that something that you think's missing from people as they're sort of becoming writers? Is the opportunities for learning about production or creating showrooms, or do you sort of need to hope that you fall into something and you have people like you say, the Brads and the Robert Coopers, that can share that?
Yeah, you know what? We did benefit from being able to learn on the job. I mean, one of the podcasts like this really help. For instance, if I will tell like new writers anything, is one of the most common mistakes, one of the most surprising mistakes that first time writers make when they come in and pitch a show or really write for a show, in the case of specifically Stargate, is not knowing the show. Once a writer came in and pitched stories for I don't know, the characters, and didn't even know the name of our characters, which never bodes well. Pitching episodes that would break our budget. That's a big one, and that essentially demonstrates production savvy. I mean, if you come in and you can pitch, I mean, I know not everybody loves them, but like a bottle episode that makes use of our standing sets, that shows production savvy, and that shows creativity. I'm not saying that's the way to go, but I mean, it's something to think about. Just really producing on the page is a skill, and if you can demonstrate that skill in the pitch and in your script, you will be well served.
And I think with one of those things I was quite curious about as well, like with Stargate, and in particular your work that you're talking about there, sort of like bottle shows. I mean, say to any sort of fan of any series and clip show episodes, and people will roll their eyes, but that was something Stargate seemed to do incredibly well. And I think like with that, clip shows, there was episodes politics, comedy, action, adventure, romance. Like it truly was a sort of diverse show. And it sounds like from your kind of background as a writer that you were well served to come onto a sort of show like this, where one week you could be doing something like a comedy like Window of Opportunity, then Scorched Earth, you've got kind of like that, and then other episodes where it's battling about the politics and the minutiae of the military. Is that exciting as an author, and how rare an opportunity is that to write such diverse TV?
That was incredibly rewarding, and that's one of the things I always mention, the fact that every episode of Stargate was almost like a mini movie, and you could do horror, you could do mystery, you could do comedy, you could do all-out action, you could do very mythological, philosophical stories, and ultimately it was whatever your strengths lay, those are the type of stories you could pursue, and really, it was amazing. And it's something that really, an opportunity you don't get on all shows. I mean, Stargate, it did have some serialized elements, but really was more episodic, which is, an increasing rarity, I guess, in a lot of sci-fi nowadays. Dark Matter, on the other hand, was a lot more serialized, but again, we had the opportunity to do the same thing, where it was really a lot more serialized, but it was episodic in nature as well, and we were able to mix up the type of stories we could tell. So that is the type of show that appeals to me, where really you never know what you're going to get when you tune in.
Mm-hmm. And with something like kind of with that, like we talk about, say, something like Stargate, and that kind of idea was quite episodic, to something like Dark Matter, which is quite serialized. I always think, quite looking back on something like Stargate, was that it felt like ahead of its time in terms of how it would sort of use serialization and almost the integration between sort of, you had something like SG-1 and Atlantis kind of concurrently running for a few seasons, that like it could be fed in. And I think it was on one of the documentaries where it was always like, well, when we're writing these stories, we're always thinking of it as one big universe, as opposed to Stargate's this and SG-1, whereas something like Star Trek, for much of that time, was all very, very separate. Do you kind of look back on Stargate and how it was quite integrated, and some of the serializations of these huge arcs lasting years or several seasons, do you think it was ahead of its time in terms of that, going from that 90s into the 2000s?
Yeah, I really think it was. I mean, I really have to give it up to Brad, Robert, and Jonathan Glasner, who was one of the original architects of the series, and the fact that they created a mythology that was so deep and so rich that we could explore it so fully over so many years. I remember at the end of season 4, Paul and I were sitting in my office, and we were exhausted, because really the stories we wrote were kind of one-off stories. I think back to Window of Opportunity and The Curse and Chain Reaction and Point of No Return, and we just were looking ahead to season 5 and thinking, I don't know how the hell we're going to be able to keep coming up with stories. But as it turned out, the fact that there was so much mythology and there were so many stories behind us gave us the fodder for new stories to tell. And so, exactly that. It was, you just, a kind of a universe of ideas flourished from the previous season, so that basically Stargate Atlantis gave birth to, sort of a different world, well, different galaxy, really, but really a different world of ideas, and yet they were very much rooted firmly in the world of Stargate. And so, even though the Wraith were very separate, there were elements that were still very much from the original series. And it was the same with Stargate Universe. Even though tonally the show was quite different, it had a lot of like elements as well.
One thing I quite liked, and I always wondered about it from a writing perspective, because I always thought it must be exciting for every season of something like a Stargate, where like it wasn't like many other sort of TV series, say like, a Star Trek or many other kind of, syndicated or cable TV series, in terms of that there would often be opportunities for transitions. It very much felt like a believable military science structure where people could move on, people could move away. Whereas certain shows, like, people stay in that same position. Well, we've got to keep all those people on the ship for 7 years. What was that like as a writer, to have opportunities where you could go, well, we can maybe move this character on, bring someone new in, change up the dynamic? What was that like as a freedom to have that as a writer?
It was great. Are you referring to just the secondary characters?
Yeah, well, I always think of something like, say, with Stargate Atlantis, for example, and even sort of SG-1. With SG-1, you could go from sort of having someone like Don S. Davis as your kind of base commander, to Richard Dean Anderson, to Beau Bridges, then people like Ben Browder coming in, then with something like Atlantis, you could have Tori Higginson being kind of stepping aside, and then with Amanda Tapping, and then Robert Picardo, and that kind of always seemed to invigorate and mix up the kind of characters in a way that kind of very few other sort of shows were doing at that time. That it felt like I had a kind of quite a fluid, regular cast, which seemed to present opportunities for the writers each year.
Yeah, that's one of the nice things about having an ensemble, is that you can make those changes as time goes on. in all honesty, in the case of really more, it was really had to do with Richard Dean Anderson, who at the time, had spent, I think it was around season 6 that he began to sort of curtail his commitment to the show, and so we were trying to think of ways to, keep him around, but really have an in-story reason for why he's no longer leading SG-1, and really Don, the late Don Davis, was the one who suggested his character retiring and allowing O'Neill to become General O'Neill and take over the SGC. So that was one of the steps that we took, and then ultimately brought in Ben and Claudia. And I was a huge fan of Farscape, and I love them. And Ben and I loved it, and Ben was terrific. Claudia was terrific as well, and we wanted to make her a regular in season 9, but the network was like, no, it would be too much like Farscape, which was really ridiculous because her character was so far removed from Aaron Soon, but in any case, so we signed her to, I think it was like a 4 to 6 episode deal for the 9th season, and she was so good. And Sci-Fi came back to us and said, okay, we changed our mind. We want to make her a regular. But at that point, the ship had sailed. So we're like, if we come back for season 10, we'll do it. And of course, we did come back from season 10 and we do it. And then certainly Vala and Cameron Mitchell reinvigorated Stargate, I think, those last 2 seasons. And then, like you said, basic characters coming and going. Certainly, always mix things up. You talked about Samantha Carter coming in to Atlantis for season 4, Bob Picardo coming in for season 5. I'm a huge Robert Picardo fan, loved his work on Voyager, and really the arc of his character on Stargate, I think, was one of the best of any character on the franchise. The fact that really comes on in, I think, season 7 of Stargate SG-1 as kind of this pencil pushing by the book, pain in the ass bureaucrat who over time his character doesn't change, but he gains depth, and you realize he is who he is and why, and ultimately he takes over as a commander of Atlantis, and he becomes really this very interesting, vulnerable, very likable character. And there's that scene that Bob pitched very late in the season where he's in his Atlantis uniform and he has his old suit, basically his trademark suit, and he's standing in front of the mirror, imagining himself back in the suit, and I just thought that was a great moment. Writing the character was a lot of fun, but a lot of the time it really comes down to the performer. I mentioned Zoe Palmer, I mentioned David Hewlett, but Robert Picardo was another one who was just like a joy to work with, and just made writing for his character so fulfilling.
I interviewed Robert Picardo last year for the show, and it was an absolute pleasure. Like, I can't imagine how exciting it would be to be essentially working with someone like that and writing for him. It must have been a real joy for someone like yourself.
It absolutely was. And actually he's one of the few actors. I mean, I still keep in touch with a number of the actors I've worked with over the years. But he is one that every time I'm in LA or every time he's in Toronto, we will get together and have a dinner.
With that, then obviously kind of after Atlantis, Stargate Universe came on, and it was quite in a way, a wildly different tone to probably what Stargate was at the time, but it felt very kind of that modern thing that something like Battlestar Galactica, another sci-fi show, would come on. Felt very much in that mold of that HBO series. What was that like as a kind of writer to get involved with something like that? Was it something where, you're putting aside perhaps more of the comedy elements to really embrace something a bit more darker and very human? What was that like for yourself?
I'll be honest with you, it was a bit of a challenge for me because one of the things I loved about SG-1 and Atlantis was the humor, the ability to write humor, and certainly there was a lot less of that in Stargate Universe. It was dark, it was a lot more grounded, and I enjoyed writing for it. It was just, to be honest with you, tougher. To be honest, for me, I don't think I really hit my stride on Universe until the finale. Actually, we did like a 3-part Insurrection 1, 2, and 3, where really it was more action driven, and I was always been a big fan of. If I can't write the comedies, I always like the more action driven, or somewhat character driven episodes where you have like a dozen things going on at the same time, and you're jumping from 2 characters here doing this, another 2 characters here doing that, and ultimately having everything dovetail in satisfying fashion at the end. Those are the type of stories I love to do. I mean, I think back to Atlantis, and recently I did a blog post about my top 10 funnest episodes to write. Really, the top 10 episodes I had the most fun writing, and one of them was an episode called I was going to say Remnants. Was it Remnants?
Oh, I can't remember off the top of my head. I'll have to get it.
But basically it was Picardo's character Woolsey meeting and falling in love with a new member of the expedition. It was Zelenka off, on some planet. It was McKay and Zelenka dealing with some sort of a weird alien anomaly. It was Shepard on the mainland with Kolya getting his hand cut off, which I remember I was told was too dark and to change, but I didn't, and I'm glad I kept it in. And then at the end, basically, these 3 seemingly disparate stories come together and really pay off at the end. So we did a lot of that in Stargate Universe, but kind of minus the bolder, humorous beats.
I have to ask you, as a Scot, like, I remembered at the time when it was announced that Robert Carlyle was coming on to Stargate, and for me, he is one of, like, not just Britain and Scotland's finest actors, but he's just an incredible actor. What was it like to work with someone like Robert Carlyle? That I find, I can imagine him as quite an intense, serious guy. What was someone like that? You almost think of the Richard Dean Andersons, Robert Picardo's, quite jovial and things like that. What was he like to work with? I'm so curious.
He was very serious, very professional, though. I mean, you talk about certain actors and you think, oh my gosh, they must be difficult to work with, but he was not. He was terrific. He always knew his stuff. He was always great. He always, delivered he always delivered or surpassed expectations. Whenever he came to set, he was ready to go. And just like a very nice guy. I remember, apparently he approached Brad before the start of production, and he said, well, what kind of an accent would you like me to do? And he had I think he demonstrated like a half dozen different levels of the Scottish accent, from highly discernible to hardly discernible at all. And I found it very interesting that when his on-screen character spoke, I mean, he was accented, but you could understand what he said. And yet sometimes when I would see Robert in the just at the catering line getting lunch, and he would start talking, half the time I wouldn't understand what he was saying.
Yeah. I think it's with Scottish accents, I think in particular, and I think like Paul McGillian as well, and a fellow Scot on the show, I always think like it's the Scottish accent. See, when it's like someone, and his character was no stranger to it, but when you get those angry Scottish accents, that's when it's like, wait, what's that person saying there and stuff like that? Exactly. Are they going to actually come and kill me? It sounds like you never want to get on the wrong side of an angry Glaswegian, I think.
Yeah, I believe it.
With that, and then obviously kind of like Stargate Universe came to an end, and you got to write the final episode. What was that kind of like? Because it's one of those ones that for fans of something like Dark Matter and Universe, they blend in really quite well together, the end of one and the start of another, in terms of your creative story. What was that like to bring to an end to sort of the Universe world at that point?
Well, I'll be honest with you, at the time we were writing it, we did not know it was the end. In fact, we were offered a third and final season. The idea was floated that we would be able to do a third and final season to wrap up the story. And then things took kind of a really weird turn at the end, and that offer suddenly disappeared, and we didn't know what was going on. And to be honest with you, when we were producing or writing the episode, we didn't know it would be the end. But Paul and I sat down and said, well, if it possibly is the end, what are we going to do? And so I wrote that family scene where essentially Eli makes the toast, and talks about how they're family. And really that toast sums up for me the type of sci-fi that I love, the type of sci-fi that I write, the type of sci-fi that I have written in the past and I hope to write in the future. It very much follows the same pattern, whether it's SG-1, whether it's Atlantis, whether it's the crew of the Destiny, or the crew of the Raza in Dark Matter. They are kind of a de facto family. Just these very different personalities who don't always get along, but have no one to rely on at the end of the day but each other, who come together, and they're almost like a second family for viewers who tune in. And so basically I wrote that scene, and then Paul had the brilliant idea of visually bookending the show, because if you remember Air Part 1, in the opening, we begin, the series starts with these shots of the Destiny lighting up. We go through the various levels as things lights up, the gate room and the corridors light up, and it's coming to life. And he did the opposite. Everybody went into stasis, and slowly but surely we do it in reverse, and all the lights go down, and we just see Eli alone in the observation deck, and that ship. We see the ship, and it jumps into FTL, and really that jump to FTL was, I guess for me, one of the most heartbreaking visual effect shots I've ever seen, because usually when we watch the show, we see them jump to FTL and we see them come out the other side. We join them on the other side, and this is one of those instances where we see them go, but we don't go with them.
I'm curious as well that with obviously that kind of came to an end in and around sort of 2008, and that much has obviously been written about things like the financial crash, and I'm a fan of James Bond as well, and obviously that's involved with MGM, and I mean that put in the end to sort of the James Bond franchise for a few years, really. Something like Skyfall was held up. I'm curious that with things like sort of the financial crash and how that affected actually television. What was it like to be a writer in that kind of post-Stargate world where, we think of TV at that time where, money was scarce, whether it was MGM or people investing in original TV, but there was a huge spike in reality TV shows, game shows like Deal or No Deal. What was that period of time like to be a writer looking for work in that kind of financial period?
Well, it was triply difficult for us coming off Stargate for so many years, because essentially you're on Stargate and you're off everybody's radar. Really, in LA, no one really knew Stargate, because it wasn't a network show, it wasn't a big network show. Even though we did ultimately 17 seasons of television, they didn't know. And I remember Rob Cooper going into a meeting once and said, worked on Stargate, and they were like, "Oh, did that air in the States?" And we're like, "Well, yeah, it did air in the States." So there was that, and unfortunately, Brad and Robert, especially in the case of Brad and Robert, this kind of drives me nuts. That they made MGM Studio so much money with the Stargate television franchise, and really any other studio would have given those guys overall deals. But MGM didn't, because they were changing, their ownership was changing, and then the new guys came in, and then they never did. And on the flip side is sci-fi, that to be honest with you, I always felt that they kind of begrudged our success. Mm-hmm. And I don't think they were ever particularly supportive of the show. Because we're never really their show. They picked us up, and they aired us, but we were never really their show. And so essentially when we got it's not as if Sci-Fi welcomed anyone of us with particularly open arms either. In fact, actually, I remember after Stargate ended, there was a sort of a new regime came into to sci-fi, and I was like, oh great, maybe I'm going to go in and pitch them Dark Matter because at the time I had basically produced over 300 episodes of television for their network. Mm-hmm. I assumed they would know my work, and my agent said, this new guy who came in isn't a fan of Stargate, so I don't think that's a good idea. I thought, not a fan of Stargate? I mean, and if you're not a fan of Stargate, and if you've seen Stargate and you're not a fan, that just kind of tells me you're kind of a fan of, I guess, sci-fi without heart, mm-hmm. if you will. So, that was kind of disappointing. So, it was difficult, and we did a couple of shows that we weren't really happy working on. They were very different experiences from Stargate. But ultimately, we landed Dark Matter, and that was a great experience.
Yeah, Dark Matter is such an exciting kind of, origin, really, that, mm-hmm. It's an original comic book that became a TV series, or is it sort of a TV series that, right, we're going to make it as a comic book first, then kind of put it into the TV. What was sort of the origin of really Dark Matter and of its, from comic to screen?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said, I've been working on Dark Matter for, I'd say maybe between 5 to 7 years developing it, because we kept on getting picked up on Stargate. So I knew the story I wanted to tell, and I had a pilot script. And ultimately, it's all about IP now. Everyone likes established properties. Because they like to say that it's been proven, but really what it is I suspect people have a hard time greenlighting original projects because a lot of executives can't tell a good project from a bad project. They basically will greenlight a project. Let's say someone is attached, like a big time director or an actor. But if it's an original idea, no matter how good it is, they're not going to take a chance on it. But if it's a book or a comic book, then they say, they can put their asses on the line, if you will. And if it's a success, great. If it's not a success, they'll say, well, that's strange. I mean, it was an established property. So it's a way of really essentially covering their asses. And it's great for basically people who don't know sci-fi to be able to just kind of greenlight stuff that is IP, which we're seeing a lot of. In the case of Dark Matter, I knew we were up against it. So I pitched Dark Horse about really launching the series as a comic book, and they liked the idea, and we did. And ultimately, Jay Firestone, the president of Prodigy Pictures, ended up taking out our pitch, and the pitch was accompanied by the comic book, and it was just a great sort of visual accompaniment that allowed executives who tend to imagine the worst possible execution of your vision. It allowed them to basically look at it and say, "Oh, this is what we're going to get." And so, in that respect, it was fantastic. In the interim, I've always been like a huge comic book fan too. I read a lot, and I think that the Dark Matter scenario was kind of a very unique scenario. I mean, as time has gone on, like I have like a half dozen original ideas that I eventually, I would love to sort of turn into TV shows, but ultimately for me now, the point of my career is I just want to tell stories, and I'm kind of gravitating towards the world of comic books. I said, because I'm familiar with the world, I love the world, and not really as a means to get into television, but just as a means to tell story. I think the comics medium is fantastic.
Do you feel that sort of come full circle almost, that animation break that you got when you were younger? Do you feel that kind of pays off for something like this, where it gives you a chance to show your creative styles and you've learned so much, obviously, from all your time as a kind of writer?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you've got to know the genre. You got to, I think, to a certain extent, really respect and love the genre, which I do when it comes to comic book. When it came to animation as well, I'm also a huge anime fan. I think basically the world of animation is behind me now at this point in my career. But the allure sidestepping into the world of comics is very much there. And amid all the stuff I'm working on, I would really like to get back into writing a comic book.
Well, one thing I'd love to kind of know about with something like kind of Dark Matter, what's been the thing that surprised you? Obviously, you've worked under some incredible showrunners and becoming showrunners yourself. What kind of surprised you about it when you're the man making that kind of decisions and creative choices? What's been the most enjoyable part, but what's been some of the most challenging sides of it?
In the case of Dark Matter, just because I created the show, I developed it with Paul, but ultimately when it came to show running, I show ran the show, and I was all over the show. I ran that writer's room. I wrote half the scripts. I rewrote all the scripts. I oversaw all of prep. I tried to be on set as much as possible. I was in post, did all the post. So that really was a challenge. It just takes so much out of you, because you want to have your hand in everything, and I think that can be a bit of a mistake. I think it's great if it's somebody else's shows. You basically don't feel quite the I guess emotional investment. I mean, you're still invested, but not to the point. I'm sure I was invested on Dark Matter, where I would be up till 2 a.m. rewriting every script, making sure that every setup paid off. So I mean, that was a challenge. The reward, obviously, is the fact that it's very much your show, and the collaborative aspect. I've always been about the collaboration. So I always told the cast, look, hey, if you ever have any issues, come see me. We can talk things out. And Roger Cross and Anthony Lemke would always come by my office to talk, and Zoe Palmer. I always used to joke that Zoe used to text me more than my actual girlfriend because she would have suggestions or line changes. So the collaborative nature of the production was always something that I really enjoyed, and the challenge. And then the other thing is, what I didn't like about it is the fact that even though you're the showrunner and you're in charge, there's always going to be someone kind of breathing down your neck, and that's just kind of a reality of making television.
One of my kind of penultimate questions is that we kind of touched on it just before we started our episode, was that when I was a sort of a teenager in my 20s, I loved, especially with the sort of Stargate work in particular, would be your commitment to things like audio commentaries, DVD extras, sort of that fan interaction where I learned so much about the creative process, the challenges. I even learned the Stargate theme tune from listening to an audio commentary. What was that? That has always been that part of you has been interested in collaborating and sharing your kind of knowledge from your privileged position as someone that's learned and seen the highs and lows of being a kind of television and creative talent. What's always been behind that? Because for people that know Stargate, it's not just knowing the characters, for example. It's knowing someone like yourself that drives it, really.
Yeah, I mean, before I actually landed on Stargate, I didn't really know the show that well. And so I went online and I went to a bunch of communities and really got to know the show through the fans. And that was essentially my way of, I guess, giving back. And, as sort of I continued working in production and actually writing my blog, I began to notice that a lot of productions really put moratoriums on visuals and they were very secretive about plot developments. And I understand you don't want to give away spoilers, but I always like to sort of differentiate between spoilers and teasers. For instance, if you're going to feature a spaceship, I don't really see giving fans a sneak peek at, let's say, the modeling or the creation of this spaceship as a spoiler. I see it more as a teaser to whet their appetites. I always find that, in a lot of shows, and even Stargate was guilty of it to a certain extent, they save so much, or they keep so much stuff back, that basically when they release it, it's really only for the fanboys and girls. It's, rather than use it to engender interest in let's say, other sci-fi fans who may not know the show, or maybe people who don't even know or are not necessarily sci-fi fans, by just keeping it till after the episode airs, you're kind of preaching to the choir. So, one of the things I tried to do on Stargate that I really set out to do on Dark Matter as well is really reach out to like the fans and make them feel like part of the process. They were in on, when the show was picked up, the construction of the set, the Raza. They were in on the concept designs. I would dial them in early and throughout the process. Again, not giving away any spoilers, but really making them feel like, they are part of it. And, for that reason, I think, the show had, like Stargate, a very passionate fan base.
And I think it's one of those ones that, I think for writers and fans that we can learn so much from these things. And I was saying to you earlier, like, DVD extras and commentaries are so rare to even get these days that I think that knowledge of people like yourself, where we can learn so much from, is being potentially lost, and we're losing such a valuable kind of source of knowledge. And it's great that all that stuff is there. I mean, I would watch the episodes and I would buy the DVDs solely to hear that kind of insight and extra stuff. So it feels like that's one thing we've just kind of lost in the past few years. We may have Twitter now; it's easy for people to interact with creative talent, but we're maybe missing that extra bit of knowledge. But thankfully, with things like your blog and your work, that we're getting that knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully.
And that's my final question is, like, I'd love to hear what kind of, obviously you're potentially working on things just now that you might not be able to talk about, but is there any sort of projects that you can talk about at the moment? And as a creative person yourself, what books and films and TV are you watching and being inspired by at the moment?
It's funny. People always ask me, what are you watching? And the truth is, when you're in production, you hardly have time to watch television. And really, when you're not in production, in fact, I'm juggling various development projects. I do a lot of reading. I mean, this is an insane reading year. I'm up to, I believe, last I checked, 238 books.
Wow. But
in all fairness, I'd say like maybe a quarter of them are graphic novels. So everything, like I said, from general fiction to nonfiction, sci-fi, fantasy, horror, mystery, thrillers. So I'm an avid reader. So that's really, takes up a lot of my time. And also just juggling development. I'm at the point now where, I'm down to, I think a half dozen real projects. Say real projects because, I keep the fans, as you said, updated on the blog. And at one point, I think 2 months ago, I was juggling 18 projects in various stages of development. Either they be pitches or takes or actual scripts I'm writing for networks. And people always react and go, "Oh my gosh, what if a bunch of them are greenlit at the same time?" But the reality is, you're lucky if one of them goes. So sure enough, 12 of those projects fell by the wayside, and now we've got 6 potential contenders. One of them is a sci-fi series for a network. It's actually a near sci-fi series, but it's actually alien world based, and it's really interesting. It's basically I wrote a Bible and a pilot script, and so that is under consideration right now. I'm basically hopefully poised to write a pilot for a supernatural small town horror series. I'm actually going to be working on the adaptation of a comic book series with a comic book author who I'm a huge fan of. I have been for a while. That's something actually that just came up. I'm close to starting adaptation of another horror novel, basically a horror author that I loved. That basically I happened to just luck into being connected to the acquisition of the rights to one of their latest books. And actually, I've been offered a showrunning opportunity for a series that, if the deal closes, it'll close hopefully this week or next. And I can't announce it right now, but it's a sci-fi series that is very different from anything I've ever done. So that is kind of interesting. So I mean, they're all possibilities. And if I was much younger in my career, I would basically be overwhelmed and thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to juggle all this stuff? But the fact is, maybe that deal falls through. Maybe, the network passes on this pilot. Maybe, I get ghosted, which happens a lot, by the way, in this industry. A lot of the time when you're working with people and you're developing something, when they choose not to go forward with something, rather than say, it doesn't look like we're going to be moving forward on it, they just stop emailing you or responding to your emails, which is galling. I think they think that it's easier for them, less confrontational, and it opens the door for future collaboration. But in my mind, I don't want to work with someone who, I did a pitch for a game, a big sci-fi game. I was asked to pitch for, and so I pitched them, and I never heard back, and I followed up with emails, and I never heard back, and then I had my agent get in touch with them, and my agent said, oh, they really loved collaborating with you. They decided to go with someone else, but they really want to work with you on something else in the future. And I just said, why would I want to work with them if they can't even be bothered to get back to me? Yeah. So really, this is something to look forward to. When you get into the industry, or anyone who gets into the industry, be aware this does happen. And it's just, again, part of doing business, I guess, here.
Well,
film and television.
Thank you so much for sharing so much of your kind of knowledge and history, and it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with someone like yourself today, Joseph. And if people want to track all these different developments, where's the best place to kind of reach out to you or kind of follow you on social media? I know we've mentioned your blog, for example. Where can people find these? We'll obviously put these all into the show notes.
Yeah, sure. You can find me on my blog. You just do a Google search for my name, Joseph Mallozzi, Mallozzi, and it'll be one of the first things that pops up. www.josephmallozzi.wordpress.com. As I said, I blog every day and blog about everything from development to production to comic books to books to my dogs. So every day you'll get something. Otherwise, come find me on Twitter. I think Twitter is an invaluable tool for any script writer or director. I'm Baron Destructo. Easy enough. So basically, come find me on Twitter. I actually always interact on Twitter. I read, if anybody @s me at Twitter, I will always either respond or acknowledge their comment, and if they have questions, I will try my best to answer them. And also, I'm on Reddit. If you happen to mosey on by the Stargate or Dark Matter subreddits, I will be there.
Well, that's perfect. Thank you so much again for coming on today. It's, to give up an hour of your time when you've got so many different projects on the go, it means a lot to me. And when I saw obviously that I could reach out to you and potentially get you on the show, it's been a real buzz for me today. It's been a real honor. So I wish you all the best with all your different projects. And if any of them ever kind of come off, we're welcome to have you back on if you'd ever like to come on and talk about them.
I would love to.
Well,
thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Joseph. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Join the revolution. Join the Nerd Party.
Welcome to Nerd Party.